I guess freedom is one of the biggest desires that we have. It's one of the biggest topics that we could think about in a week like this. And this desire that we have as human beings to be free. And actually, we can talk about freedom in different ways, can't we? We can talk about political freedom. I'm old enough to remember when freedom came to many countries in Eastern Europe. I've been many times to the country of Romania, and they remember when freedom came there. I was in Ukraine just before the great protests that led to the overthrow of the government and the great expectations and hope that there were for freedom, but in many ways unrealized. We can talk about freedom of speech, of course, and the desire to preserve that freedom of expression, to be able to speak out on particular issues. But we can also talk about personal freedom, the freedom to express ourselves in the way that we want. And I guess behind our time at university, as well as, of course, the desire for academic success and hopefully a job at the end, the desire to be able to discover ourselves, to be free, is a great part of it too. Freedom's a really big subject. Some of our biggest films and our greatest or most loved films also explore this topic of freedom. One of my favorites, The Shawshank Redemption, freedom from imprisonment. Or Les Miserables, freedom from oppression and injustice. Braveheart, freedom from the English, I guess. But freedom is something that we desire, something that we long for, something that we don't always, though, feel that we have. Now, you might think it's ironic that we're looking at the Christian perspective on this topic tonight, because perhaps when we think about the Christian faith, we don't always assume that Christians are the most free people on the planet. In fact, we can often think otherwise. Perhaps the most famous Christian in the world today is this guy. And Ned Flanders put it this way. He said, "Listen, folks, there's no magic formula. I just follow the 3 C's, clean living, chewing thoroughly, and a daily dose of vitamin church. And of course, I resist all the major urges. No, no, and double no. I haven't done any of those things, folks. You name it, and I haven't done it." To which Homer says, "Geez, Flanders, you're 60 years old, and you haven't lived a day in your life." But that's maybe, of course, a caricature, but a caricature of how we perceive the Christian faith is lived out, which is a life of restriction, of repression, of rules, of regulations. It seems to be very much the opposite of what we desire when we think about freedom. You can understand maybe why one church had this as their sign, although I'm not sure it's quite what they meant. Why be depressed alone? Come inside and join us. So we don't think that Christianity brings freedom necessarily, but actually it's also worth asking whether atheism brings freedom. For actually there are many atheists who would actually admit that logically and consistently speaking, a materialistic worldview doesn't really give you a foundation or a basis to talk about genuine autonomy or freedom. Freedom in such thinking is at best an illusion. For we are ultimately governed by 2 things, our DNA within and the environment without. And it is those things and those things alone that determine who we are, and what we do. Determinism might be the most consistent outworking of the materialistic worldview. So actually, can we be free? And we might want to ask more fundamentally, what is freedom? What does it actually mean to be free? Let's listen to how one group of existentialist philosophers described it. They're otherwise known as One Direction. And this is how they describe freedom. Let's go crazy, crazy, crazy till we see the sun. I know we've only met, but let's pretend it's love. And never, never stop for anyone tonight. So let's get some and live while we're young. But actually, believe it or not, One Direction are really expressing what has been the general view on freedom ever since the Enlightenment. Basically, post-Enlightenment, our main perception of freedom is that freedom is the ability to do whatever I want, whenever I want, however I want. Freedom is life without restrictions and life without any limits, the ability to be completely autonomous from anything or anyone. I wonder if that's how you would define freedom tonight. But I guess what I want to do at the outset tonight is to ask the question, is that post-Enlightenment view of freedom, a life without any restrictions or limits, actually too simplistic a view of freedom? Does it actually work out in reality? Let me give you 3 illustrations. The first comes from New Zealand, where I was, as I mentioned yesterday, a few months ago. And it was this event. A whole pod of pilot whales had become beached upon the shore there. It made national headlines. In fact, it made headlines back here in Europe as well. And if I was to ask you the question, are those pilot whales free? The answer, of course, is no, they're actually dying. Because a whale is, of course, not free on a beach. A whale is free in the ocean, for that is the environment in which a whale expresses its freedom. If a whale decides to declare its freedom from the ocean, it no longer is free, but it's dead. Which raises an interesting question, which is, in what environment do we most fully find our freedom? And are there environments and contexts in which, instead of finding freedom, we could find spiritual or emotional death? That's one illustration. The second illustration comes from the United States and is slightly more embarrassing on my part. About 16 years ago now, I was in a relationship with a girl who lived in the United States. And her family every year went on a skiing holiday just after Christmas. And they very generously invited me to join them for their annual skiing holiday and were willing to pay for it, which was great. The only problem was that they went skiing every year, and so were obviously quite good at it. I had never actually been skiing in my life. So living in the south of England, it's not the easiest place to learn to ski, given that we get snow about every 20 years. So I went to a dry ski slope just outside of where I live. That's about 10 meters high. And I ordered or purchased 3 one-hour lessons in skiing. And in these skiing lessons, basically, my instructor spent a lot of time trying to teach me how to do a snowplow. And I thought, what is the point of having skiing lessons when all they teach you to do is how to stop? I mean, that's really dull, isn't it? I mean, surely the whole purpose of skiing is going, and all they want to tell me is how to not go. And so I didn't really listen to much in these lessons, I have to confess. I thought, well, sooner or later I'll be out in America, I will be free, I'll no longer have an instructor telling me to stop, I will finally be able to ski. So I flew out to the States and arrived in Colorado. When we went to the resorts, we hired the skis, we got to the chairlift, and we started going up the mountain. First thing that I realized was that this mountain was quite a lot higher than the slope that I practiced on back home in England. But as we came to the top of the mountain, we dismounted the chairlift. I managed to do so successfully, which was, I felt, at least a start. And I was sliding very slowly across the top of the mountain, just where people kind of stop to do their boots up before they actually start skiing. And I was sliding very slowly, but because it was a kind of gentle gradient, I was still moving at this point, and I didn't just come to a natural stop. So I thought to myself, well, I'll need to make sure I can stop and do up my boots, and then I'll wait for the others. Only problem was, of course, that I had actually no memory of how to stop. So I just kept on going, slowly at first, but kind of through a very crowded area who were having to kind of move out their way to let me through. And before I knew it, I was actually on the actual red run, and I was picking up speed, and I was thinking to myself, how do I stop? And I thought, there is one way, of course, that you can stop, but I didn't want to fall over. I thought that would be embarrassing in front of my girlfriend and her family. So I thought, I need to think of a way to stop that doesn't involve falling over. And at that moment, I saw to the side of the piste, there was a very large forest. And I thought to myself, if I could just ski into that forest and grab one of those trees, I will be able to stop. So I went off the piste, through the off-piste, into the forest, and smack into this first tree. I'm lying on my back, both my skis have come off, I've got bruises from head to toe. My girlfriend skis over with her family, and she says to me, "What were you trying to do?" And I said, "Well, I was just trying to stop." She said, didn't they teach you how to stop? I said, yes, but I didn't listen to that part of the lesson. She said, well, if you can't remember how to stop, just fall over. And so that's what I did, actually, for the rest of the day. I just went faster, faster, fall, faster, faster, fall, faster, faster, fall, all the way down the mountain. Well, actually, not all the way down the mountain. I was so slow that by nightfall, I was only halfway down the mountain. They had to send a skidoo up the mountain to rescue me and take me back down. The next day, her dad very kindly paid for me to have lessons with the 5-year-olds on the nursery slopes. And then for the next 8 days, I flew down every Black Diamond run in that resort in this kind of ridiculous snowplow formation, trying to make up for lost time and desperately trying to impress my girlfriend after everything that had just taken place. Now, I would love to tell you that it worked, but sadly, about a month after I got home, she dumped me. 2 weeks later, she started dating a ski instructor. And before the year was out, she had married him. Now, I'm not asking for your pity. It was 16 years ago, and I have subsequently actually learnt to ski, you'll be glad to know. But I thought I was free because I had no one telling me what to do. But actually, I wasn't free because I was under the control of something that came up on the screen earlier, gravity. And gravity was taking me where gravity wanted me to go. I wasn't as free as I thought I was. And sometimes maybe we think that we are free because we have no one telling us what to do, but are we free, or are we just following the crowd or following our impulses? Are we really free to do what we really want to do? The third illustration comes from the film Frozen. And I wonder if I'm not going to sing it, don't worry. There was a sharp intake of breath from over there. I don't know whether that was the excitement of Frozen or the shock of thinking I might be about to sing this song. But the point in the song when Elsa sings this. She says, it's time to see what I can do to test the limits and break through. No right, no wrong, no rules for me, I'm free. In other words, I don't want to be repressed. I don't want to have to control these powers that I have. I want to be free to do what I like. And so she is, and she does. But then she says this, you mean well, but leave me be. I'm alone, but I'm alone and free. Because her expression of freedom, although it allows her to build a nice castle, means that she's no longer free to enjoy a relationship with her sister. So then she continues, I'm such a fool, I can't be free, no escape from the storm inside of me. See, her freedom and her expression of freedom allowed her to do one thing, but actually it prevented her from doing what she really deeply wanted to do. And I say all of those things to say that actually this idea, this post-Enlightenment idea that freedom is just the ability to do whatever I want, whenever I want, is actually a whole lot more complicated than we might think. What happens when our desires conflict? How do we express our freedom then? So I want us to think tonight about the Christian perspective on freedom, and particularly to look at what Jesus has to say on this subject. It's from a different account of the life of Jesus than the ones on your tables, although they are free for you to take away. But tonight I want to look at some words of Jesus that come from John's biographical account of Jesus' life. For in this particular context, he speaks on this subject very specifically. And I'll just read it out from the screen. Hopefully you can also see it. It says this, to the Jews who had believed in him, Jesus said, if you hold to my teaching, you really are my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. They answered him, we are Abraham's descendants, and have never been slaves of anyone. How can you say that we shall be set free? Jesus replied, very truly, I tell you, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now, a slave has no permanent place in the family, but a son belongs to it forever. So, if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. So Jesus is speaking on this subject of freedom, and basically he's saying two things on this subject. Firstly, and perhaps quite shockingly, he's saying this, you are not free. And in particular, this was shocking to the people Jesus was speaking to, the Jewish leaders of his day, because they say, well, we are free. And they say, we have never been slaves to anyone. Although that was somewhat ironic, given that at that particular point in history, they were oppressed and under the control of the occupying Roman forces, and over the previous few hundred years had been under the control of other forces too. But they said, we are free. But Jesus says, actually, you're not. You notice what Jesus said? He said, everyone who sins is a slave to sin. He says, actually, we are slaves, but not necessarily slaves to physical forces or to someone else, but to something else. It's this thing that Jesus describes as sin. Now, the problem is sometimes when we think about this concept of sin, we have different images that come to mind. Chocolate, at least in Britain, is described as sinfully good. I'm sure in Switzerland it's even more sinfully good because your chocolate is better than ours. So when we think of sin, we think of the naughty but nice things in life, the things that are pleasurable. And so we think that sin is simply some category of enjoyable experiences that some people seem to deny. But actually, when Jesus is talking about sin, he's talking about something far more fundamental and profound. One philosopher put it this way, I thought very helpfully. He said, sin is the human propensity to screw things up. The human propensity to screw things up. That natural tendency in the human hearts to go the wrong way. It's a little bit like, maybe Swiss shopping trolleys are better than British shopping trolleys, but if I go to a supermarket back home and I get one of those big shopping trolleys, because I'm doing a big shop, I find that the shopping trolley goes in every direction apart from the one that I actually want it to go in. Left, right, backwards, but it never seems to go forwards. It has this natural tendency to go the wrong way. And in the same way, sin is this natural tendency in the human heart to go the wrong way. I found it illustrated very helpfully in a song by the American singer-songwriter John Mayer. It's a song called Gravity. And in that song, he asks this question. He says, what makes this man, with all the love his heart can stand, dream of ways of throwing it all away? He says, gravity, stay the hell away from me. Gravity has taken better men than me. Just keep me where the light is. Just keep me where the light is. See, what John Mayer is saying, he's saying, what is this unseen force that's a bit like gravity that tends to pull me down so that I become less than the person that I really want to be? What is it that means that actually we can have great desires in life and yet somehow we never seem to live up to them? One New Testament writer in the Bible put it this way. He said, the things that I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, I end up doing. Do you know what that's like? I mean, like you say, well, I'm never going to do that again, and then you do. Or you say, well, I'm going to do this, and you don't. Why is it that so often we fail to live up to our own expectations, let alone the expectations of others? Well, Jesus says it's because actually there's a force, a thing, it's called sin, and it causes us to be less than the people we were made to be, so that we are not free. Now you might say, well, hang on a minute, I am free, but I just don't choose to be. Or if I wanted to, I could live a different kind of life. I could achieve the hopes and standards that I want. But let me kind of throw out a challenge, okay? Imagine tomorrow I'm going to challenge you to live the morally perfect life. According to your own standards of goodness, I want you to live the perfect life, treating others as you would want to be treated, in actions, words, and thoughts, always doing what you think is absolutely the best thing. To do that just for one day tomorrow. I wonder how well you get on. Well, I reckon you'll probably do really well for about 7 or 8 hours. Then you'll have to wake up, and then it will get a lot harder. Because in reality, though we joke, that is the case, isn't it? That often we fail to live up to our own expectations. But what is it? Jesus says it's because we're slaves of this thing called sin. But, Jesus says, wonderfully, secondly, although you are not free, I can set you free. Because Jesus says, if the Son sets you free, speaking of himself, you will be free indeed. So how does Jesus set us free? I want to just suggest briefly as we finish 4 ways that Jesus sets us free. And firstly, Jesus sets us free from guilt. The Bible says the problem with sin is that it has implications. It has implications for us in that it screws up our lives. It has implications for our relationships, for it cuts us off from those that we love. But it also has implications with God. Because actually, if God was a perfect and just God, then actually the stuff that we do has to be accounted for. There has to be justice. And all of us, the Bible says, have this problem of guilt because of the stuff that we've done before God. What do we do with that? Günter Grass, the famous German author, died a couple of years ago now. But just before he died, he wrote his autobiography called Peeling the Onion. And in it, he revealed something that was absolutely shocking to many of his readers. You see, Günter Grass had spent much of his life revealing those who had been involved in the German SS, the Nazi SS, during the war. And as a result, actually ruining the lives of many others. But what he revealed in his autobiography is that he himself had been a member of that organization in his youth, but just no one knew. He himself had been guilty of the very thing that he had been accusing others of. And he said this, "It will stain me forever," but it had to come out. And that sense of peeling the onion, of many layers, is true of all of our lives, isn't it? We have layers. Maybe the outward layers are attractive to the world, but there are things in all of our lives that we wouldn't want to come out, that we wouldn't want others to see. But wonderfully, at the heart of the message of Jesus is this, that we can be freed from the guilt of all of that stuff because he has done something about it. The heart of the Christian message is that through Jesus' death on the cross, he took personal responsibility for all of those things. He paid the cost that we should pay and took the consequences that we should face so that we don't have to. So Jesus says we can be free from that guilt because he's taken responsibility for it, offering us forgiveness, as we thought about last night. So that we don't have to hold it anymore ourselves. We don't have to carry baggage with us through life. We can have a clean slate and a fresh start and a new beginning. So that's the first thing. Jesus says, I can set you free from guilt. But secondly, he says, I can set you free from the destructive side of your human nature. We've said that this thing called sin is a bit like this unseen force of gravity that drags us down to be less than the person that we should be. And yet Jesus is saying that actually when we come to know him, he is enabling us to be set free from that force that would drag us down. But in what way? Let me illustrate it this way. You know what it's like if you go flying? You sit there, and if you're unlucky and you're flying with EasyJet or something like that, you're in the middle seat, and you're waiting for the other passengers to come in, and then you find yourself sitting amongst the sumo wrestling team of Japan, and you realize that your space is now somewhat more constricted, and then you look outside and you see the baggage going into the plane, and I don't know about you, but I sometimes have this thought when I stop and think, how heavy is this plane? And as I look at the people getting on, as I look at the bags getting on, as I think about it, I think, well, this plane is actually very heavy. And you taxi round onto the runway and you bump over every bit of concrete as you go, and then you sit in your seats as you get pressed back with the force of the engines and you're rushing down the runway. And a few moments later, of course, you're in the air. And as you look down on the ever-decreasing size of the houses below, you ask yourself the same question, how heavy is this plane now? And the scary answer, of course, is it's just as heavy as it was a few moments before when you were sitting on the concrete. And so the question, therefore, is, of course, why are we now in the air and not on the floor? And that is because, although there is still a force of gravity that is acting against that plane, dragging it down, as it were, there is now a greater force overcoming that force that is literally lifting it up. And that in some ways is a picture of what Jesus is talking about when he talks about setting us free. You see, the Christian life is not one where we are set free in the sense that we no longer feel any desire or temptation or struggle with things that are wrong. we will. But it does mean that there's now a new force, a new power at work in our lives, freeing us to become more than what we were before. A new force setting us free. Let me illustrate. Tom Tarrance, a few years ago, was the most wanted man in America. He was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. He was a very evil man, and he'd been responsible for the deaths of a number of others. He was so wanted by the FBI that there was an order to arrest him and to get him dead or alive. And so he was captured in an operation. He was shot, but somehow survived, unlike some of those with him. He was tried and then imprisoned. In prison, he managed to escape. He was captured a second time and shot a second time, and still managed to survive, and was imprisoned then for a second time. In prison, in isolation, in solitary confinement, he started to read the New Testament. And as he read the New Testament, he encountered this person called Jesus, who not only offers to set us free from our guilt, but also offers to transform our lives. And in that prison cell, he encountered Jesus Christ personally for himself. As a result, his life was transformed. And through his influence in the prison, the lives of other prisoners were transformed too. As a result of his transforming influence, he was then set free. And if you were to meet him today, as I had the privilege of doing just a couple of years ago, you would find him as the one most gentle, gracious, and kind gentleman that you could ever meet. You see, his life has been radically and utterly transformed by the power of Jesus Christ. Now, that is just one example, perhaps an extreme example, but it illustrates that this actually works. Jesus really can transform our lives in a positive way. But here's the third thing. Jesus not only sets us free from the destructive side of human nature, but free to be who we were made to be. You see, there are two aspects to freedom. We need to be set free from that which is destructive or restrictive, but we also need to be set free for something that is positive. In fact, this is illustrated beautifully in the film The Shawshank Redemption. The film tells the story of Andy and Red. Andy played by Tim Robbins, Red played by Morgan Freeman. And the purpose of the film is that Andy wants to work for the freedom of Red. He wants him to be set free. And yet, earlier in the film, we've seen another character who has been set free from the confinement of prison, and yet within a few days, tragically, he's taken his life. Because although he's free from the prison, he's got nothing to live for positively. So Andy not only works so that Red could be set free from the prison, but he also works tirelessly to create a life for Red to live in when he finally gets out. Because he understands that freedom is not just from that which is repressive, but also it has to be for something positive. And in the same way, freedom that Jesus brings is not just freedom from that which is destructive, to lead a boring and dull life, but it's freedom to discover the purpose for which you were created. It's freedom to discover what it means to be truly human in the way that God created us to be. Freedom to discover our unique gifts and abilities and skills, and then freedom to discover how we can express them for the good of others and for the benefit of the world. It's not just freedom from that which is bad, but freedom for something which is ultimately good, for our good and for the good of others. And then finally and fourthly, Jesus says that the freedom that he brings can also set us free from fear. Because actually the fear of the future is, for many, a great fear. Not just the fear of the unknown of the next few years and what life might hold, but ultimately, as we'll think about tomorrow lunchtime, freedom of the ultimate thing that happens in the future for all of us, which is death. I mean, the reality is statistics haven't changed. 1 out of 1 people die, and it will happen to us, like it or not, at some point. And the reality is for all of our advancements and for all of our wealth and for all of our knowledge, that is one thing that we will not avoid. And yet Jesus elsewhere says this. He says not simply that he has the answer to death, but he says that he is the answer to death. That through his resurrection from the dead, he is able to offer real hope that goes beyond death itself. Now that claim of the resurrection is one we're going to look at the 12 o'clock lunch talk tomorrow. So do come along if you want to look at the evidence for that claim, for which there is plenty. I would encourage you to check it out. But if it's true, it means this, that in Jesus we not only have freedom for now, but we have freedom that will take us even beyond that ultimate enemy of death. And I think that's really important. Before I went to study in Edinburgh to do my degree, I was working for a summer just outside Leicester, as I said, on that farm. And during some of my time there, I worked with another guy who was a bit older than me, called Barry. He was already married and he had 2 children. And we worked together on a few projects. And then when I went up to Scotland to do my studies, we kept in touch occasionally. And then I heard that his wife, Paula, had been diagnosed with cancer. She was taken for treatments, but sadly they were told that there was no more treatment that could really be offered and that she was going to die. And she did, just a few months later. And no one who went to her funeral service will ever forget the events of that day. And in particular, one thing that happened. As they brought the coffin into the front of the small village church where the family lived, they played a song over the loudspeaker. It was a song that was quite well known to some of the people who went regularly to the church. It was one that they often sung. But everyone was shocked because the person who was singing the song was Paula, the woman who was now in the coffin. You see, just a few weeks before her death, she knew she was dying, and she'd asked that she would be recorded singing this song and that this song would then be played at her funeral service. And the last words of the song say these words: "No guilt in life, no fear in death. This is the power of Christ in me. From life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man could ever pluck me from his hand. Till he returns or calls me home, here in the power of Christ I'll stand." And she could sing those words because she knew they were true. Because she could face the reality of death with hope. And I hope you forgive me for just being serious for a moment here, because actually the reality is, although we may hope, and I do hope, that for all of us it will be a moment in the distant future, it is a reality. And Jesus is the one who says, I have got the answer to it because I am the answer to it. And where else do we turn to find an answer to something as big as that? So let me ask you the question. That is the freedom that Jesus offers. Freedom from guilt, from the destructive side of human nature to be who we were made to be, and the freedom from fear, even the fear of death. My question would be, have you experienced that freedom for yourself? Do you know anything of what that is really like? Well, what I'm going to suggest is we're going to have a short piece of music now, which gives us just a few minutes to reflect on what we've heard, maybe to think of the questions that you'd like to ask in a moment, and to think about what our response to it might be. So I'll ask the musicians to come and to sing, and that will give us a chance, just in the quietness, to think through what we've been thinking about tonight.
I'm only human after all. I'm only human after all. Don't put the blame on me. Don't put the blame on me.